It's time to kick off with our first panel, Neighbourhood Watch, where we take a look at the key political and geostrategic developments and trends in Asia. As you all know, the Australian government has described Australia's external environment as the most challenging since the end of the Second World War. To understand that environment and how Australian government and business will navigate it or can navigate it, we are joined by some terrific experts for this panel. Gill is the Executive Director of the Centre for China Analysis at our very own Asia Society Policy Institute. Bates is a deeply experienced China expert who has held a number of research and academic leadership positions in Asia, Europe, and the United States. Mike Green is the Chief Executive Officer of the US Study Center. He served on the staff of the US National Security Council from 2001 to 2005, first as Director for Asian Affairs with responsibility for Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, and then as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for Asia, with responsibility for East Asia and South Asia. And finally, Lavina Lee is a Senior Lecturer at Macquarie University. She's also a non-resident fellow of the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., as well as a non-resident Senior Fellow at the US Study Center. The panel will be moderated by Ben Westcott from Bloomberg. Please join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage.
Yep. Hello, everyone. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here to host the first panel of the Sydney edition of Asia Briefing Live. It's very exciting. Now, we'll kick straight off because obviously we're running a little bit behind time. But before we begin, just a reminder to everyone that there is a Q&A, not a Q&A, there is a poll that we'd love you all to take part in. It's a QR code on the flyers on your seats, or if you're watching online, there's one on the website. And the question for that poll is, how is the Australian government currently handling the relationship with China? Now, this is the first time we've asked that poll since the Albanese government came to power. Between 2019 and 2021, the three times that it was asked, the answer was always less than 3% saying that they were handling it very well, and more than 60% saying they were handling it poorly. So it'll be interesting to see what the results are today. Absolutely. Now, just to kick off, a question for all three of you. What do you see as the main risks to security and stability in the coming year? Oh, sorry, we'll start with you, Bates.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks very much, Ben. And I want to also extend my gratitude to Asia Society Australia and to all the sponsors for the opportunity to be here today. It's been just a great privilege and pleasure of mine over the last 5 to 10 years living here in Australia to have had such a good relationship with this organization. And it's been my very fortunate circumstance to even deepen that more recently, having joined the Asia Society Policy Institute, headquartered in New York. It's a long commute, but I'm managing it rather well. And I'm glad to have had the chance to be here live today. A lot of things we could point to, and Anthony has already sort of laid out the agenda for what some of the big challenges are likely to be in 2024 going forward. I guess I would draw this crowd's attention, I think, most of all to the forthcoming Taiwan election to take place, I think, around January 12th or something like that, early January next year. All indications currently point to the likelihood that the Democratic Progressive Party candidate will prevail. And that's obviously going to, I would hope, instill some much deeper thinking and reconsideration on the part of the Beijing authorities, who I think, if that were the outcome, would have to come to the understanding that the KMT, the Kuomintang party, the right of center party that Beijing would probably prefer, may well have lost its position as a viable political force, at least at the level of at the national level in Taiwan. And that's going to have to force some sort of rethinking. I guess the question is, will that rethinking result in something more accommodating, something more practical, something more in the way of seeking longer-term coexistence with the Democratic Progressive Party in Taiwan, or is it going to force thinking in the other direction, to ratchet up pressure, to further increase in terms of military and other coercion on Taiwan in ways that just increasingly destabilize the situation across the Taiwan Strait. If I were to predict, I'd say it's likely to be the latter, knowing what we think we know about Xi Jinping and how he operates. So that combined with the likelihood that the issue of China and Taiwan will be more prominent in the U.S. election cycle than it's ever been, I would say in the last 50 or 60 years, that's a recipe for some real potential instability.
Same question to you, Lavina. I mean, what do you think is the biggest risks over the coming year?
Well, I think one thing's clear to probably all of us is that it's difficult to predict what's around the corner. I don't think any of us expected what we were reading on Saturday evening when I opened up my mobile phone and saw what was going on in Israel and Gaza. So when I was preparing for this, I would have agreed wholeheartedly with you, Bates, and I still do. I do think that the election in Taiwan in January of 2024 is going to be really significant. I've been in Taiwan a couple of times this year. Was very fortunate enough to go for various research trips. And I do agree with Bates as well that it seems clear that the current party, which has had undergone a great deal of coercion from the Chinese government, will probably be returned. But that's not to say that this is not an issue, that I see a lot of parallels in the conversations that we've had here. This polling question that we have here about whether the Australian government is managing the relationship well with China, that goes on in Taiwan as well. And that resonates with people in Taiwan, and the KMT is aggressively pushing the line that the current government effectively provokes China into coercing them. So I do think the government will be returned, and without being alarmist, I think we do need to take seriously the idea that there's a centenary of the Chinese, the PLA coming up in 2027. It might not be strictly a deadline that we will see a conflict in 2027, but it's clear that President Xi has told his military that they should be ready. So we should take it seriously. And if it's not 2024, I'm not talking about 2024, but it's something that we have to see is coming on the horizon. I won't speak too much. I want to leave Mike with something to say, but I think there's something, obviously, what's happening in Israel and Gaza has a great potential to become a wider confrontation. The gathering evidence that Iran is involved and advised Hamas or supported Hamas in this confirms, I think, to Israel that they can't work with Hamas. Obviously, the atrocities that are being documented and shown to the world now mean that Israel will want something decisive in Gaza. They don't think they could work with Hamas, and that there will be, I think, some kind of action taken against Iran. That's my view on this. It's not going to just be a limited conflict.
And just to finally, the same question to you, Michael. I mean, what do you think over the coming year are the biggest risks that the world faces?
Well, it's tough going. It's tough going last because you're left with things like the New Zealand election and
very significant election.
Not that I'm terribly worried. Look, I think the Bates characterized the Taiwan situation well. I think the possibility of a crisis because of the election is not high, but a significantly new level of tension that endures, I think, is likely. Lai Ching-te is not Chen Shui-bian. He's in his heart of hearts, he'd like independence for Taiwan. I have no doubt about that. But the DPP has internalized the lessons of Chen Shui-bian. I was in the White House and met with him many times on behalf of President Bush. He did not think Chen Shui-bian about how his actions affected support for Taiwan in the U.S., Japan, Australia, Europe. Tsai Ing-wen does, and Vice President Lai does. So I don't worry about an independence push provoking war, but the problem is that Beijing has already started catastrophizing the return of this government in Taiwan, and you already see a level of PLA operations that's unprecedented, that has gone from breaking previous norms by crossing the dividing line of the strait with fighters and bombers. It's gone from that to full-on military exercises that are hard to distinguish from preparation for war. So it's that level of tension will be pronounced and will continue, but a war over the election, I think, highly unlikely. I agree actually with Lavina about Iran and Israel. This is highly significant for the Indo-Pacific. Because of the effect on energy prices and the global economy, because of the obvious diversion of American resources and attention to the Middle East. It's like that movie By the Waterfront. You keep trying to get out if you're American, you keep getting pulled back in. But also because of the proliferation concerns and the linkages with North Korea. So very, very serious. The one other sort of wild card that no one has mentioned, which I am watching for, is news about a Chinese security agreement with a Pacific Island nation that results in military basing and a crisis for this government in Canberra and for the US, New Zealand, and others. I think that's not probable, but quite possible in the coming year.
Thank you very much. And don't forget to tune into Bloomberg's wonderful coverage of the New Zealand election this weekend on Saturday. Moving on to AUKUS, because obviously that's, it's hard to have any discussion about the region and Australia's role in it without discussing the AUKUS Pact. Lavina, just starting with you, how is AUKUS reshaping Australia's relationship with other countries in the region?
Well, I think the the first thing to start with is the fact that the initial shock, I think, to the region when AUKUS was first announced in 2021 has dissipated quite a lot. And I would say that that's a success of the Australian diplomatic service to have, before the announcement this year with all the details about Pillar 1, that they've spent a lot of time making calls to local leaders to reassure them about the proliferation risks, and to reassure them that this is a contributor to stability rather than instability. So if you look at the reactions of the region, I think you could say that some support it, some explicitly support it, some tacitly support it, but no one has actually condemned it. And I think that sends a signal that there are real concerns in the region about the balance of power, that the balance of power might be shifting, and that the AUKUS agreement could be part of a rebalancing, or like what Penny Wong likes to describe as a restoring the strategic equilibrium. So if you were to do a kind of survey of countries, some look at the AUKUS agreement and think, oh, this is potentially an opportunity for us. Why don't we try and join on to the AUKUS agreement? So you can see probably the most likely candidate might be Japan. Japan is the one with the closest, strategic threat assessments. It's trying to increase its defence spending to 2% by 2027. It's talking about counter-strike capabilities. So the ideas of Japan being involved not in the submarines but in AUKUS Pillar 2 on quantum computing, on hypersonics, that could be a real possibility. Now, one of the problems is that Japan doesn't have a real intelligence community. It's not part of the Five Eyes, and it really has to develop those habits and culture of secrecy in order to be involved in this type of thing. And we talked about New Zealand. Surprisingly, New Zealand wants to be part of AUKUS, so we'll have to see what New Zealand might be able to contribute. But we can also see that India, initially, I think India would have loved to have been part of an AUKUS agreement. And there have been some commentators who said as much. But what would be notable is that India has actually done a lot for Australia in the IAEA, where China and Russia were attempting to scupper the deal by basically saying that Australia was exploiting a loophole in the NPT on nuclear propulsion, and India was able to help us to block that opposition. In terms of Southeast Asia, I would put Philippines, Singapore and Vietnam as being either explicitly or tacitly supportive of AUKUS in terms of balance of power. And even the most vocal countries that have expressed some reservations, like Malaysia, and Indonesia, I think they're toning down their rhetoric, and there are expressions of understanding about Australia's defence needs. And yes, they might talk about the proliferation risks, but I think Australia's been quite successful in explaining that we're really not getting the technology. We'll be delivered a black boxed capability, and that the IAEA will be able to inspect it.
Michael, when there are criticisms of AUKUS in Australia, obviously the one we hear the most, we've heard it most vocally from former Prime Minister Paul Keating, is that it means that Australia is giving up its strategic independence to be a part of this pact. What's your response to that?
Well, I think you have to look at AUKUS in a broader geopolitical context and in the broader context of alliances and alignment. The reality is, because of the contested environment, because of the threat envelope spreading out from the PLA and uncertainty about Xi Jinping's intentions, the challenges in maintaining a balance of power, for all those reasons, as the opening speaker noted, there's a lot more alignment. AUKUS, U.S.-India, U.S.-Japan, which people don't focus on enough. All of these alliances and partnerships that we're talking about involve greater mutual interdependence. And there's always a tension between security interdependence and sovereignty. And it's multi-directional. Some of you may have seen recent reports about a U.S. Congressional Research Service, which assessed the AUKUS submarine deal for members of Congress. And it had a list of pros and cons. And predictably, the press only focused on the cons. But one of the cons they mentioned for Congress was, do we want the U.S. Navy submarine floors to be dependent on Australia for basing, for workforce and technology development, for security of information? The answer is yes, Congress supports it, but it was a question being raised for American politicians about dependence on Australia. Japan, under Abe, revised its interpretation of the Constitution to get rid of the ban on collective self-defense. That was always the Japanese government's way of staying out of anything America got involved in. Abe convinced the Diet and the public to change that so that Japan can get involved if there's a crisis in the region, to accept dependence, to risk entrapment. This is happening across the board. It's not just Australia. So I think you have to look at AUKUS in that context. AUKUS in and of itself does not create this situation of dependence, and the dependence is multi-directional. The U.S. is depending more on Japan. The U.S. is depending more on Australia. That gives Australia and Japan greater voice and agency, but it comes with it, some questions about sovereignty, but it does for the U.S. too. One of the very interesting questions we will have to figure out is, the Defense Strategic Review and the Defense Strategic Update is based on the premise that Australia now has zero warning time. So historically, the defense planning assumption was Australia would have 10 years warning before an unnamed country nearby that's not New Zealand could threaten. 10 years, that's plenty of time to build up an industrial base, to mobilize. It's now zero. You can't have the same sort of distance from your allies in that environment. And Japan made its decision based on a very similar assumption about Japan now being not in the rear area of a Taiwan or Korea or other contingency, but in fact in the front lines every day. So when you think about alliances that are based on zero warning time, the ones that come to mind for me are NATO and the U.S.-Korea alliance, where the force posture and the command structure is set up to be able to fight tomorrow if we have to, because you don't have time. I don't predict or think that the U.S.-Japan, U.S.-Australia, the Quad are likely to create that kind of combined command readiness to operate immediately, but those pressures are there. And all sides, including the U.S., are going to have to manage that. And the last thing I'd say is, yes, Australia will rely on the U.S. and U.K. for nuclear propulsion technology, which, by the way, the U.S. has only ever transferred to another country in 1957 to Britain. So yes, there will be dependence on the U.S. and U.K., just as there is on the U.S. or U.K. for pretty much every system the ADF uses, whether it's AF, whether it's F-35s or frigates or destroyers, or even the Collins class, where the weapon suite is made by U.S. firms. So this idea that Australia is suddenly dependent on the U.S., U.K. or others for kit is a little silly, because it always has been. More dependent, perhaps. It's a bigger spend, but it's not in that sense unprecedented.
A really interesting point. Just before we go to you, Bates, let's point to the poll where so far we've got 22% of people saying that the Albanese government is handling the relationship with China very well, 72% saying fairly well, only 6% saying not very well. So that's a very big turnaround from the previous polls, perhaps driven by the great news last night about Chang'e being released. Now, just to you, Bates, on AUKUS, I mean, what is the Chinese government's view of AUKUS, and do they have any particular options to respond to it?
Well, for all the reasons we've just heard from Lavina and Mike, obviously they are not happy at all about this development. But that, I think, is already to be banked into any sort of strategic thinking we have on our side. I mean, China was not going to be happy with any signal that the U.S.-Australia relationship is getting deeper and more integrated, no matter what the particular program in mind may have been, AUKUS or otherwise. China's never going to be happy to see a strengthening of that relationship. So I think we just have to take that as part of our as part of the environment. They are particularly, however, I think maybe more so than some other activities that the United States and Australia undertake, they would be particularly unhappy with the AUKUS agreement, precisely because of its strategic nature. Its unprecedented nature, its strong signal to the region of a deepening of the U.S., Australia, and yes, the UK relationship in ways that I don't think anyone really would have fully expected even just a few years ago. So that's worrisome, I suppose. It is worrisome to folks in Beijing. What can they do to respond? Well, I would think if I were advising the folks in Zhongnanhai about what to be really worried about, would be more of the phase two levels of cooperation, because as we all know in this room, it's going to be a long time before there is a viable operational nuclear propelled submarine fleet from Australia. That's going to be quite some time to come yet. So in the meantime, I find much more, if I were in Beijing, much more worrisome is the development of a lot of other technologies in relation to power projection by Australia, standoff strike weaponry, working in the quantum area, and so forth to help develop even further capacities across a broader range of militarily relevant technologies, well beyond, and in many ways, I think even more important than for the long term, what might come about as a result of the submarine element of this new pact. And of course, they're not standing still. China, they already vastly outnumber Australia and even in some respects American capacity in terms of their submarine fleet. They're going to continue to make advances in their own nuclear propelled submarine force. And so, looking out 20 years or so, we should expect China to continue to even build even further, and to maybe even make more problematic and contested, our ability to deter China going forward. So they're unhappy, of course. They've made efforts within the IAEA to try and portray Australia as a bad international actor. So they are taking steps to try and undermine international confidence. I don't think they're succeeding particularly well in relation to Australia. But more importantly, I think they recognize the seriousness of this, and we should have every expectation that they're going to be continuing to build up their military capability to counteract it.
Yeah, just staying with China for now. Lavina, yes, so Australia's entered a period of stabilisation with China. And yesterday at the Asia Briefing Live Melbourne event, we heard Ambassador Xiaoqian say that he'd like to see the relationship move beyond stabilisation. The stabilisation to him wasn't the sort of end game for the relationship. I mean, in your view, what's the best that Australia can hope for in its next stage of relations with China?
Well, I think this word stabilisation has been used a lot by Australian leaders, foreign minister, the Prime Minister, and I think it's very deliberate. It's not a reset, and I think everybody was, I shouldn't say everybody, I was a little bit worried with the new government that that the word reset would be used, because if you use the word reset, then you're really potentially backsliding from taking hard decisions. So I think the word stabilisation is used deliberately to say we do have differences in our interests, and with the change of government, a lot of those differences in interests have not gone away, and they're not likely to. And I think if you look forward in the next 5-10 years, the way the geostrategic competition is moving, the hardening of that competition between the United States and China, but also between Western democratic countries and authoritarian countries. This is a hardening. It's not a softening. And there are, in fact, I think, even less areas of collaboration and cooperation that are possible. So a lot of these, I think, attempts to cooperate or collaborate are really being viewed through a strategic lens. Like, how does that collaboration and cooperation actually affect the relative power position between the two? I shouldn't say blocks. That's what China likes to use, the word blocks. So if you were to look at some of these enduring divergences in interests, yes, it's wonderful that Cheng Li was released yesterday. I think her detention was most egregious because it seemed completely like a political hostage taking rather than anything else. It really was a punishment, I think, to Australia. We still have one Australian citizen still detained, and he's more, I think, a democratic activist and an academic, and perhaps it's there might be other reasons as well for his detention. But apart from citizens, we have trade problems. Coercion continues. There's still trade bans on lobster, wine, red meat. We still have a WTO case against China, I think, on wine that's continuing. It is good that we don't have a dispute on barley anymore, but I think for me, when I heard that news, what it doesn't acknowledge is the existing damage that it did to barley producers, and that it was, when you take it to the WTO, you're actually setting standards. You're defending principles and rules, and by doing a bilateral deal, you've effectively given up that opportunity. I think Australia would have won that case. In terms of other things, foreign interference goes on. Our ability to protect our democracy is a continuing problem. We've got aggressive and dangerous actions by Chinese PLA in South China Sea that could easily escalate. That continues. And of course, I think a really big one is the fact that there is a possibility of conflict breaking out in Taiwan. And this is something, as Mike mentioned, about our DSR, about zero warning time. This is not something that we can afford to not pay attention to, and it can't be a casualty of this idea of stabilisation. We should be promoting the view that we want peace in the region, and that we'll be part of a deterrent coalition to ensure that conflict doesn't break out. Just to kind of conclude, I mean, China will be pressing us on all of those things. So they would want to join the CPTPP. They don't think it's fair that they can't invest at will in what we might think are critical areas of our economy. They obviously will keep on going with their objectives in the South China Sea, East China Sea, and Taiwan. So I don't see how those things are going to go away. So yes, stabilisation, but I think our expectations should be quite measured.
Yeah, really interesting, fascinating. And Michael, the Defence Strategic Review, which was closely read by, I'm sure, everyone in this room, one of the most interesting points was that it said that the United States could no longer be considered the unipolar leader in the Asia Pacific. Now, do you agree with that? And what do you think that would mean for Australia's security?
Well, the DSR was very well received in Washington by those who read it. in the Pentagon or the White House or think tanks. And one of the principal authors, Peter Dean, is our director of foreign policy and defense. I was in Washington with him, and the senior officials, members of Congress, had very high praise for the GSR and agreed with thought the strategic assessment was spot on. But what's happening is that over the last 10 to 20 years, the U.S. and its allies have lost predominance over the maritime domain. I was in the Pentagon, one of my first jobs in government in 1996, when we had a crisis over Taiwan, much less menacing, but the first real big crisis. The Clinton administration sent 2 U.S. carrier battle groups through the East and South China Sea, past Hainan, with almost complete impunity because they could. That would be much more challenging today because of the artificial islands and enormous military airfields that China has built in the South China Sea, the massive missile inventory, submarine fleet, and so forth. The maritime domain is not dominated by China, but it's contested, and that's what's different, and that's extremely significant for Australia and Japan, which survives on the seas and the sea lanes. So that part's right. I often find the term unipolar or primacy are thrown around in the debate here, sometimes in the US or Europe, and they're not always very helpful terms. I mean, if there was American unipolarity, I would have loved to have been there for it because it would have been great. But I never experienced it. I suppose before I was born, sometime between 1945 and 1950, we had some kind of unipolarity in the US. We had half of global economic output. We had, in 45, close to 100 aircraft carriers in the Pacific. But by 1950, we had 1. And we were struggling to hold on to the Pusan perimeter in Korea against a Sino-Soviet North Korean alliance. In the 70s, we had a quarter of global economic output. Nixon's opening to China was not about primacy. It was about maintaining a favorable balance of power and sort of getting China's help, frankly, in dealing with Soviet hubris as Vietnam became a problem. And even in the sort of brief unipolar moment in the 90s, it was very fleeting. And there are, by my count, maybe 2 U.S. government documents that have sort of said this is the reality. Early in the Clinton years or late in the Bush, in 92, a document leaked from the Pentagon talking about unipolarity. And then the Trump White House had a document saying the U.S. goal is primacy. But those kind of the exceptions that prove the rule. The U.S. strategy has been to maintain a favorable balance of power. What people often forget is that Americans want security as in the cheapest possible terms, and unipolarity and primacy are not cheap in any way. So I think that is essentially what the DSR was saying. The term unipolarity was a bit misleading. The reality is this region is increasingly multipolar, and U.S. strategy and I think the Australian government strategy are about how to harness that multipolarity, how to build stronger relations with India and the Quad, how to work with Japan more, and now Korea and the Philippines. A lot of that strategy, by the way, isn't even American, it's Japanese. I mean, the Quad, free and open Indo-Pacific, a lot of this was Abe's idea. It's something I wish people may pay more attention to as well, because it shows how much agency allies can have in shaping strategic thinking in the region. So well regarded, the DSR called it right. Maybe unipolarity wasn't quite the right term to use, but it certainly caught everyone's attention.
And just a reminder to everyone that if you've got any questions for the panel or for future panels, you can ask that using the QR code on your seats or via the QR code on your screens if you're watching remotely. Bates, just to you, it's been, China elite politics has been described as playing chess inside a black box. So I'm going to ask you to do that now. Recently, China's foreign and defense ministers have disappeared from public view. Do you think this represents a crisis inside China's elite structure?
I probably wouldn't characterize it as a crisis. I mean, that really suggests that Xi Jinping's in trouble, that he's, perhaps even on the verge of being removed or something like that. That is not the case in my view. But it's certainly a signal, nevertheless, that there is some disgruntlement. There is maybe a few holes being poked in what seemed to be this invincible aura of Xi Jinping as the great leader in China. I mean, he's had a bad year, or bad year and a half, really, politically, both abroad and at home. And I think maybe what we're seeing here is some reflections of either his determination, to overcome some of that, to make sure that he's sending signals very, very clearly, even at the very, very top, to include even Politburo members in some cases, that he's still in charge, and that he's not going to tolerate what seemed to be bad behavior apparently on the part of these very, very senior leaders. All that said, I mean, just let's set aside Li Shangfu and the foreign minister, the defense minister and the foreign minister. I think it is nevertheless still true that even at lower levels, we're seeing sort of tensions and divisions becoming more apparent within the broad body politic of China. I mean, I think there are tensions among elites. That's really what I think we may be seeing in the cases of Li Shangfu and the former foreign minister. But in addition to that, I think we can also identify increasing tensions sort of between the center, Beijing, and what it's expecting of its local governments, provincial and municipal. And of course, we also see pretty strong evidence of increasing tension sort of between the state, or let's call it the party state, and the broader society. Whether that's reflected in the sort of the involution and lying flat of Chinese youth, reflected increasingly, I think, in the understanding within the middle class and even upper classes that the whole, the success story of the Chinese economy, that success model is confronting some real serious, very, very serious headwinds, particularly within the real estate sector, where so much of Chinese middle and upper class resources are invested, personal resources are invested. That's creating tensions as well between, the party state and the society. I'm going to be watching all of this very, very carefully in 2024. It's fascinating. I think there are bigger holes and problems and challenges facing Xi Jinping than we probably realize, and his effort to sort of reassert or reestablish sort of his authority in this relatively narrow aspect of simply, seeing to the removal of the defense minister and the foreign minister, who, let's not forget, are actually not all that important in the overall construct of the Chinese party state, is just one small aspect, actually, of a much bigger set of challenges that he's going to be facing across the various dimensions of society and elite politics.
Yeah, really interesting. Now, I've got about 5 minutes left for the panel, so we're going to treat the last three questions as a bit of a hot fire round. Was that with you, Lavina? Anthony Albanese is likely going to visit China before the end of this year, at least he said he will. What would your advice for the Prime Minister be before he visits to China?
Okay. Oh, I hope I'm still on. Can you hear me? It's all good? Yeah. Okay. I say, thank you. Thanks, Ben. First thing is that, one, I think China will only offer concessions on things that it shouldn't have done in the first place. So I think we should remember what is the status quo, who actually changed the status quo, and to not fall for that trap. So making concessions on things that they shouldn't have already done, like coercion of various sectors of our economy, releasing that is not a concession. That's just returning to the status quo. Detaining Australians for no real reason is also not something that we shouldn't expect. So I think just to remind the Prime Minister that these are not real concessions, but in that vein, that we shouldn't offer too much in return for what is really something they shouldn't have done in the first place. And if you do that, I think it will actually encourage even more coercive or illegitimate behaviour in the future. The second thing I think is that the Chinese will try and convince Albanese, our government, and enlist their support for the idea that the tensions in the region are really a US-China thing, and that it's not something that Australia and other countries in the region should be involved in. So it suits China to have less players interested in things like Taiwan or the South China Sea rather than more. It's much simpler for them to take out as many strategic players as possible. So this includes Australia remaining aloof from the Taiwan issue, and I think that's a mistake if we don't actually use this opportunity to press on the Chinese that this is a major concern, that the lack of transparency around Chinese military and nuclear modernization is of concern to the region and to us. Finally, I think when you have a meeting, it's wonderful that we're having a meeting. That's great. But when it's not all about being friendly. Friendliness is not the aim and objective. The Chinese will be assessing what is our strategic clarity. Do we have strategic clarity about what our aims are and our interests are? And what is our resolve? So that's the kind of signalling that he should be promoting in this meeting, his strategic clarity and resolve on these issues.
Yeah, fascinating. Michael, there's a not insignificant chance that we could be seeing a second Trump presidency by the end of 2024. What do you think of what should Asia expect from a second Trump presidency?
I think we're at time, Ben. So if China's leadership and decision-making is chess in a black box, I was thinking that probably the American equivalent would be like the musical Hamilton, a grand pageant with dynamism and inspiration and dysfunction and deeply, deeply embarrassing idiocy. Australia has many cultural advantages over the US. Late night comedy in the US is better because they just have more material to work with in politics. I'm told, James Curran, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm told in 2016, which was an election, national election year in Australia, there was more media coverage of the US presidential election in Australia than the Australian election. And it's in a particular spike of dysfunctionality right now with the vacancy in the Speaker of the House. And it's deeply unnerving for allies, I know. It's deeply unnerving for Americans. However, Winston Churchill didn't actually say it, but he's reported to have said you can always count on the Americans to do all the wrong things before eventually they do the right thing. There is in the, as Hamilton, the musical kind of shows, there is in this very different structure of government from the Westminster unitary system, a set of checks and balances that amplifies dysfunction and paralysis at times, but it also contributes, frankly, to continuity and to rejuvenation. So, for example, when Trump was president the first time, he said a lot of things about pulling out of NATO and Korea and so forth that scared a lot of people, and he never did it. Why didn't he do it? Because the Congress, which had to pay for it, quietly, Republicans in his own party quietly put legislation in place saying you can't do it. We won't pay for it. So if you have a second Trump term, you're going to have a lot of that contestation, and much of it's going to be within the Republican Party. Because if the presidency goes to Donald Trump, which I personally think is unlikely, but is possible, odds are the Congress also goes Republican. And the vast majority of Republicans in the Senate and the majority in the House are internationalists and pro-alliance, and are going to put the brakes on Donald Trump. It will be harder for Australia than the first Trump administration, though, for two reasons. I'm being a little too candid here. One is that he didn't know what he was doing the first time. A second Trump administration will bring in a sort of coterie around him of people who are going to try to grab the arms of government, Justice Department, intelligence community, largely for retribution. It'll be ugly. I don't think they'll succeed. That'll be different. And I don't mean this as a partisan statement, but the reality is it was easier for conservative right of center governments to deal with Trump than left of center governments. Morrison did pretty well, actually. Abe did very well. It wasn't fun. I've talked to Abe. It was not fun, but they did pretty well. Merkel, very hard time. Trudeau, horrible. So I think for a labor government, it's going to take some discipline and some really serious thought about how to manage the alliance. We do surveys at U.S. Studies Center. We have new data in. Support for the alliance, if Trump won, would go down in Australia, but not cataclysmically. Australians support the alliance and recognize its importance regardless of the election result. But it'd be challenging. But I do think ultimately continuity is much more likely. If you look at our surveys, Gallup, Chicago Council, Americans are more internationalists than polls have shown in 30 or 40 years. More pro-trade, more pro-alliance, more pro-UN and international engagement. And by demographics, younger Americans are more internationalist. So it sort of is the trend to the future. The isolationism in the U.S. is not new. There's a bit of it on the left, and then there's some on the right. The isolationism on the right in American politics goes back to the American Civil War, frankly, when Irish and German and Hungarians fled the revolutions of 1848, came to America and argued that America is too pure for Europe. So isolationism in the US, especially in the Republican Party, has largely been an anti-Europe isolationism. And one example I like to give is in 1940, after France fell, Gallup asked Americans, should we save Britain and liberate France? And 2/3 of Americans said, no, it's not our war, it's Europe. Irish Americans, German Americans are the largest ethnic population in the US at that time. The same Gallup poll asked, should the US pressure Japan to get out of China, even if it risks war with Japan? And 2/3 of Americans said yes. So a lot of historians have pointed out that American isolationism is historically, since George Washington's farewell address, more about Europe. And the Indo-Pacific, the Asia-Pacific, the Far West, as it used to be called, is more about opportunity and not corrupting and not like the old world. So the Japans, the Australias, the Indias in particular will have a much stronger hand. It'll be a lot tougher for the Germans and the French. But I think continuity, despite disruption, is the most likely scenario. And as I said, I think if you look at the polls carefully, the people who say they would never vote for Donald Trump, not who do you like or don't like, but who would you never vote for? There are many more who say that about Donald Trump. He has a narrower path. But as you say, it's not something to rule out.
Fascinating. And final question to you, Bates. Who does she want to win the presidential election?
Who is she? It was phrased, who is she rooting for? And I thought that wasn't a phrase you could use in Australia. But anyway, well, I thought long and hard about this, and I think it all depends on what you would believe is Xi's preference. Does she prefer a deeply divided, potentially dysfunctional sort of circus of American politics that is likely to arise, at least in the early years of a Trump presidency, as he goes about attempting retribution and so on and so forth? Is that something that she would prefer? And you could make a good argument that maybe he would. Also, we might assume that a Trump presidency would, potentially reduce American commitment to Ukraine, which would presumably help strengthen Russia's goals and ambitions in that part of the world. And that all might be of some favor then to Xi's strategic outlook. He might also appreciate that a Trump presidency would attempt to try and diminish the importance of alliance relationships, at least in comparison to what we think a Biden presidency would be trying to do. On the other hand, a Biden presidency is going to be a little bit more predictable. It's pretty clear the White House is putting out relatively friendly feelers in an attempt to put some kind of floor under the relationship, and there's at least some opportunity to at least stabilize, to use the word, the relationship, certainly not get back to where we were at any point, say 10, 15 years ago. So, which of those sort of scenarios is she going to likely prefer? I don't know the answer to that. Were I advising him, I would surely say you probably want to go with something. You don't want a lot of instability and division and divisiveness within the United States. You'd probably prefer to have a somewhat more confident America that's prepared at least to work with China at some low level of stabilization, even if that might mean that all of your concerns and worries about encirclement and containment and American alliance building is worrisome to you. So I guess I would think he would prefer a Biden presidency, but who knows?
Fantastic. Look, please join me in thanking our panel here today.